Margaret Cairlockton, good evening. Look, I probably have parents contact me every week around access to the CDNT team, and I suppose there's a mixture of distress, anger, frustration and disheartened from the parents, right? Because some have more than one child with additional needs, and they are on the list, but they haven't had any sort of intervention whatsoever. Some parents of older children would say that the last time that their child had any intervention was before progressive disabilities, before the CDNTs were established. So when you had the early intervention teams, so that saw children up to 6, and then so after that, then when the age out of that, they've had no services whatsoever. We've got to the stage where the CDNTs are not actually providing any information on children, so that that's why the complex needs was removed from the set hours going into schools, because they don't have the information anymore. And I remember teaching and getting vital information from what was the child development team at the time about children coming from primary school into secondary school who were under this. And it's a big miss not having that. I suppose I know Minister Rabbitte has indicated that there's a recruitment drive and that there's a lot of interviews coming up, and hopefully that will work. We all hope it will. But there's huge numbers on the list, and you've identified that in your statement there. But I suppose a few things I want to just ask about that. You used to do a census every year of the CHOs and the vacancy rate across. Is that being produced again this year? Because I think it was around this time last year that was published. Secondly, if this recruitment drive is successful, the core registration was holding people up. Has that eased? Is that it takes, especially for people who trained outside this jurisdiction, is that becoming easier? And is the regulation of psychology, has that moved on at all? Are we any nearer to that being registered? Staff and maternity leave haven't been covered up to this. I know the manager in the CDNT in Cavan, or the acting manager, is currently on maternity leave, and I'm getting different names as to who's actually responsible now. So I'm just wondering, will team members, whether it's management or therapists, be actually covered if on maternity leave? We still have the situation with children with complex needs being abandoned in hospitals or respite centres or schools. I thought there was a better working relationship between the HSE and TUSLA, or the CDNTs and TUSLA. But my colleague Pat Daly just indicated to me recently that there was a child in a Kerry hospital left in a side room for a number of weeks anyway, if not longer, because again there was disagreement between who was supposed to be responsible for taking care of this child. I think the residential placement has been found at the moment in Cork for that child, but he did spend quite a number of weeks there without support. So do you reach out to families who are in crisis, or when you realise they're in crisis, and has cooperation with other agencies improved? Then is there any oversight as to, are these, I suppose they're not, it's hard to do it, the CDNTs, are they more effective than the previous teams? They replaced the previous structure where you had up to 6 and then from 6 to 18. But I mean, it's probably hard without them being fully staffed to know. But will that be looked at? Also, I know a lot of you talk about the AON and the lists. There's almost 9,000 people on a waiting list for an AON, and in a lot of cases, it's probably not necessary. But unfortunately, it is for school. And how do we get away from that? I can understand, it makes sense. The child goes into the CDNT, that it's an ongoing assessment while they're getting the supports and services that they need. But if the parent wants, and which they do, want the best placement and the most appropriate placement for the child, and if that child needs a special class, a special school, or an autism class, the school demands a report. And I just don't know, until we move away to a more inclusive form of education where every child is accommodated in their own local school and the supports are there, I don't know how we get past that. But it is something that we need to get past. And even I had a parent on to me just recently who's looking at accessing private support for her child, and even though she can barely afford it. But they've come back and said, oh, we need an assessment for your CDNT. And then the CDNT said, well, we haven't seen your child. We can't assess the child. So she's left in a quandary that even if she could afford to get the private support for her child, which her child badly needs, she can't, because the private practitioner is looking for an assessment. And I know Section 39s, and I mean Enable Ireland in Cavan, which the CDNT is Enable Ireland is Section 39, the pay parity agreement is welcomed. I don't know if it's still going to actually totally bridge the gap. But I don't know if Section 39s have actually received that back pay. That's going to be an issue as well. And then I realise, is it COSI, is that how you pronounce it, KOSI, are now being asked to distribute this funding to deal with the pay. And we were concerned about that because I tell you, the COVID payment, there's still organisations waiting on that COVID recognition payment, and it was administered by the same organisation. I'm just wondering why it has to be outsourced at all. Anyway, I have a lot in that and I appreciate that, so thank you.
So, first of all, the census, the staff census for children's disability network teams is being done. We identify a date in October and we do it annually on that day as a data capture. It was affected by the forced industrial action, so nobody was in a position to do returns to us. So since that has been suspended, it is progressing, so we're working towards trying to have a report in next month. So once we have that report completed, we will share it with the committee. In terms of CORU registration, I think, look, I'll have to come back to you in terms of maybe any specifics on it, but certainly the indications that we're getting is that where an application is being made by somebody where they have all their information together and they kind of put in a full and frank application, it works through reasonably quickly. Many of the issues and the delays seem to arise where CORU have to chase information or there's inadequate applications and so on. I know that CORU have and the Department of Health have also been reviewing jurisdictions and have made some changes recently and added some countries where the training in those countries is recognised, and that does aid and speed up the CORU registration process. So I'm not sure that that's the delay or the excuse, notwithstanding the fact that there are challenges in it. I can't comment on the registration of psychologists. I'll follow up on it and I'll come back to it. I know that that's a piece of work that's going on between the department and CORU. I just don't know where it's at as of now. In relation to staff on maternity leave, I mentioned earlier, like, we're not funded for replacements of staff on maternity leave, except in some aspects of service like residential services. However, we do make every effort where we can to try and provide cover. So if a manager is out, we have to put some arrangements because somebody has to be able to coordinate the team. But sometimes that involves moving people around from other roles. So you're taking from you're robbing Peter to pay Paul, a kind of thing which has consequences. It is something that we're very mindful of, and it does have an impact. And I suppose the solutions are even harder in circumstances where a team might be depleted. And to be honest, it can be challenging enough, you know, like if a staff member is being asked, will they take on the CDNM role, you know, for a period of time, just as an example, you know, it's a hard job. And it's not, you know, it's not always attractive to as many people as we want, and I think, you know, that's something we're very conscious of, and trying to make those roles as attractive and as satisfying as possible. In relation to the children in hospitals, I can't comment on an individual case. I would say that we have a joint protocol with TUSLA, which we're reviewing at the moment. The initial feedback is that by and large the protocol works well. There's a lot of very collaborative work that's done, and there are very speedy responses to many children's needs, and good cooperation between the HSE and TUSLA in responding to those children's needs. I think there are circumstances where it can be quite challenging to find, and sometimes the challenge isn't necessarily the relationship between the HSE and TUSLA, or who pays, or who's the clinical lead in relation to a service. I think those things can often be worked out very quickly. It's actually finding a suitable place that the child can transfer from. And against a backdrop where we would absolutely agree. A child in an ED who doesn't need to be there is completely inappropriate. And any day or any night that a child is spending there is a day or a night too long, and a speedy solution does need to be found. So I think the review of the protocol is with a view to us improving it, and to find ways that could improve it. And there are some things that I think will emerge out of the review that will inform some steps that we can do to make sure it works as effectively and efficiently as possible, primarily for the children, but also for the staff who are involved in it. And we hope that, certainly for the HSE component of it, we're working towards having that review. TUSA have done their review. We'll be completing ours later this month, and then we'll be working with TUSA and the department to review the protocol and to update it. I think you wanted to come in there, did you?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, the preference for most families would not be leaving their child anywhere, but it's the intervention needs to be a lot sooner. Yeah. So there needs to be maybe a mechanism worked out to see how distressed a family is, and because oftentimes if they got the supports at home, they wouldn't need the residential place.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and I think it's the point we were trying to make earlier, that early intervention is right for the child, better outcomes for the child and for the family, and does prevent or reduce the demand for other types of services into the future, and supports the child to remain at home, which is what you want to happen. In relation to the Section 39 pay and the involvement of an external organisation to assist us. So the pay agreement was agreed in just before, in November, I think it was. The HSE has been working with the department on a mechanism to release the funding. We did release a once-off part of the 2023 payment in January as a way of getting it going. Organisations are being written to this week with the data that they need to submit in order for the payments to be released to their staff. And we've asked COSI in this instance, as part of a procurement process, to assist in the administering of it. COSI aren't setting the rules around it, and all they've been doing is administering the data gathering and the administration that's needed. Ultimately, the payments will still go through the HSE. I think in relation to the point that you've made around the pandemic payment, undoubtedly there were some challenges. I'm not sure that it was. I know. And I'm not a defender of COSI, but I'm not sure it was necessarily down to them. I think they had a lot of queries coming at them, which they then needed to come to us and to the department in order to get clarification on. Mm-hmm. They weren't actually the ones making the decisions around what the parameters on it were. But undoubtedly there was learning for us from how that scheme administered to try and get this one right. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on maybe the assessment of need piece.
Sure, and the CDNTs.
And the CDNTs, yes.
Are they more effective? Because that's the question that we continue to ask ourselves. Is the policy correct? The policy, the PDS policy, is the foundation of the Children's Disability Network teams. And it, in its simplest form, it's about equity of access for all children, regardless of where they live, if they have complex or non-complex needs. So pre-PDS, so we have to go back 12 years, pre-PDS, children may or may not have got access to services. So if we take one county, I'm from County Meath myself, and I was there before pre-PDS at service level. Some children, depending on what their diagnosis was, they may or may not get access to a service. Other children didn't. And so, as publicly funded services, we have the obligation to bring all of the resources from all of 18 different organisations, including the HSE, providing children's disability services, pool those resources, so the staff, the equipment, the buildings, etc., and set up these teams which comprise of staff from all those different agencies. But most importantly, those staff brought their individual skill sets. So we'll say, you mentioned Enable Ireland, their physical and sensory disability. They didn't do autism. Brothers of Charity, very good at intellectual disability. They didn't do physical and sensory. So by pooling all of those into one team in a county, then the children, regardless of what needs they have, get access to that local team. When the teams reconfigured, the piece we couldn't predict in advance was how many children before PDS who didn't have access to a service, now they would have access to this team because they're based on need. And most CHOs said this brought hundreds of children per CHO out who didn't have services before. So first and foremost, once the teams happened, at least now each child was clear based on their needs and their families, most important. What we said we would do, we would signpost families to the right service. So to primary care, and forgive me for the language, it is the language we have currently, non-complex needs, and CD&T complex needs. The demand for services has gone up significantly, but if we can look at the Midwest, who now have their teams in place for over 20 years, so they built that service, they developed family-centred practice, which is a very different way of working than how our clinicians were, how I was trained, how Rosie was trained, and how clinicians are still mostly trained today in a single discipline manner. This approach is to work together so that when the family and the child come to meet us for the first time, we have a blank sheet and we ask them, what are the strengths? It's a strengths-based approach. What are the strengths within your family, with your child? And then what are your biggest bugbears? What's destroying the family? And then how we can support you developing your own strategies to implement in the home, how we can give you strategies. It's a three-tiered model. So we provide, tiered is the wrong word, we see it as circular. So we provide universal supports, targeted and individual, depending on individual child's needs. Universal supports are the type of supports that are common for most children or families coming to our services. Targeted are more for groups of children, maybe it's toileting or sleep adaptation or behavioural supports. That's for smaller groups of children within the overall group that come to that are eligible for our teams. And then there's the one-on-one for those children that have very specific needs. So this is what's presented and offered to families and taken up when teams are full. And obviously it's challenged when the staffing levels that we've talked a lot about this evening are there. Does it work? We have the evidence from the Midwest that it does work, and from the teams that reconfigured in 2014. The Midwest is also now challenged, although it is probably the better staffed in the country because they have that history. The model is bedded down. It's not to say that that there aren't waiting lists there. There are, because their growth in demand for services has gone up. In the last 3 years, they've reported an 8% year-on-year growth in the rate of referrals. Children with disabilities, with complex needs, are living much more than they would have in the past and with more complexity. I left frontline services 14 years ago now, and in that 14 years, the profile has changed dramatically. At that time, a team in Meath had 40% profile of children presenting with ASD. Teams are telling us now it's up to 80%. So that's a significant change, and we need to continue growing and developing our teams to meet that need. And lastly, I should say, family feedback. Consistently, our biggest complaint is about the waiting list, but the biggest compliments are from families in service.
I'm not hearing it because I don't know the families I talk to are getting any sort of service, you know, and even the family forum was very poorly attended, the last one, and you know, just parents are getting so disheartened, and you know, but and just in relation to the figure for autism, I think we are severely, below the national European average for the number of autistic children. I think it's only 2-point-something% here, and it's 4-point-something in Europe. My figures could be a little bit off there, but I know from talking to, as I am, the figures are much higher than actually we see them as yet. So we need to plan, I suppose. That's what I'm saying, both in our education system and in our disability system, for more services. Not that every autistic child is going to need support. I mean, there's lots of them just get on
Absolutely.
perfectly well with that. It's often when it's combined with ADHD or combined with something else that there's an issue. Yeah.
As well, it is, and you've referred to it like it is a whole of system need. It isn't just what the HSE does or what the Department of Education do. It's actually about the collaborative and the parallel development that both departments are doing, I think.
Yeah. Work together.
We had an interesting meeting, the first last week, with the Department of Education to look together at the prevalence of autism and what is driving it, and more importantly, what can we collectively do about it, which I think could be very positive.